The desert wind didn't just blow that night, it hunted. It came low across the red flats carrying dust, lightning smell, and the promise that somebody was riding hard behind it. Clay Mercer stood at his fence post, coffee cooling in his hand, watching the sun bleed out over the broken hills. He was 32, but the West had added years and taken softer things until his eyes looked older than his face. Behind his house sat 3 wooden crosses, and no voices answered when he spoke a name to the wind. That's why when thunder cracked like a rifle shot, and his horses began to stamp and snort, Clay's hand slid to his Colt. Storms were common, but this one rolled in, fast, dark as coal, and it carried a feeling like trouble had learned his address. He jogged for the barn, boots crunching on hard ground, and the first fat drops hit the dust, making little craters. Inside, lantern light shook on the walls. Midnight, the black Mustang tossed his head, and Clay murmured, "Easy, boy. It's only weather." Then the barn door burst open, wind screaming through the gap, and 3 figures stumbled in soaked shaking and far too alert for lost travelers. Women, all sisters by the look of them, the oldest standing forward like a shield, the middle one glaring like a blade, the youngest clinging silent. The oldest lifted her chin rein running down her jaw and said, "Please, sir, we just need shelter. We mean no harm." Clay didn't answer right away because out here a stranger's need can be real, and a stranger's story can still get you killed. He watched their hands, and he noticed scraped knuckles on the oldest, and the way the middle sister kept glancing back as if expecting men. The youngest looked half gone, cheeks, hollow eyes, too big, and Clay felt something in his chest, the old instinct to protect. "There's hay in the loft," he said, voice steady, "and it's dry up there. You can wait the storm out." Relief softened the oldest face just for a breath, and she nodded, as if accepting mercy hurt her pride. Clay grabbed blankets, a medicine tin, and what food he could spare. Then he pushed back into the rain because his mother raised him that way. When he returned, the sisters were huddled in the darkest corner, and the middle one met his eyes like she'd rather fight than beg again. He set the supplies down not too close and said, "Eat. You'll freeze if you don't, and I won't have death in my barn tonight." The middle sister gave a tired smirk and asked, "Think you can handle us all, rancher? 3 strangers in a storm?" Clay kept his face still, but his ears warmed, and he answered, "I reckon I can manage if you can follow my rules." Thunder slammed again. The youngest whimpered, and the oldest tightened her arms around her sisters like she'd done it 1,000 times. Clay stepped back toward the house, rifle ready by the window, and he watched the barn through sheets of rain waiting for riders. If you want stories like this, subscribe now and ride with me through the Old West, one hard choice at a time. And before we go further, friend, did you take your meds today? And are you keeping that coffee from turning into trouble? Morning came clean and the storm left scars, but the sisters were already working hands. Sure, eyes scanning like hunted. People do. The oldest said her name was Eleanor Hart, the middle one called herself Vivienne, and the youngest whispered Lila, though Clay heard doubt. He didn't press them because a man whose buried family learns there are lies that keep folks breathing until truth feels safe. By noon, Vivian had calmed midnight with a touch. Eleanor had mended a broken latch, and Lila found Clay's books like she'd found water. Clay saw blisters, bruises, in that careful way Eleanor watched the horizon, and he understood somebody powerful was closing in. Still, when he heard laughter in his kitchen, thin but real, he felt the emptiness in his house crack, and he hated how good it felt. That evening, as the sun dropped red, Eleanor said they'd work 3 days, then move on, and Clay nodded like he believed it. He also set 2 extra plates on the table, and he caught himself doing it, and he realized he'd already chosen a side. Out beyond the barn, the hills sat quiet, but Clay could feel the next storm not in the sky, but in the way Eleanor's eyes never rested. Somewhere in Redwater County, a man named Silas Reddick would soon hear 3 sisters had stopped running. Clay didn't sleep much, not after strangers took his barn and the wind kept talking outside. He sat by the window, rifle across his knees, watching lantern glow leak through rain glass. The Mercer house was small, but grief made it smaller, and silence filled every corner. 3 wooden crosses stood behind the kitchen, and Clay never walked past them careless anymore. His father lay under the left cross, stubborn even in death, like work could beat sickness. His brother lay in the middle, younger than a decent life allows, and Clay still argued. His mother lay under the right cross, gentle hands folded, and the West never apologized once. Folks called it cholera like a name could fence it in and keep it polite. It came down the trail with wagons, and it left with wagons carrying fewer souls. Clay remembered the first cough, his brother trying to laugh it off, and failing badly. He remembered his father hauling water jaw set hard, pretending strength was medicine enough. He remembered his mother boiling sheets, praying low and refusing to rest for days. When the fever broke, his brother Clay held his hand and felt the fight drain away. 2 days later, his father followed, eyes fixed on the ceiling like he'd seen something. His mother didn't cry loud, she just kept moving, and that scared Clay more. After the burials, the preacher rode off, and fear took half the town with him. Clay buried his mother alone, shovel biting hard earth, and the sky stayed empty. No choir sang, no bell rang, and the wind offered only dust and patience. That winter taught Clay a lesson: the world keeps turning even when you can't. So he stopped going to Dry Creek unless feed or nails forced him into town. He stopped shaking hands, because hands lead to names, and names lead to funerals. He fixed fences at dawn, he mended tack at dusk, and he talked to horses. Midnight, the Mustang listened better than people, and he never asked questions that hurt. Clay's rifle stayed clean, because a clean rifle means choices when bad men arrive. He'd seen bad men in war days, and he'd seen them after wearing smiles. Some wore badges, some wore suits, and some wore Sunday shirts, all hungry underneath. Clay learned distance. He learned caution, and he learned how to live without expecting mercy. Yet his mother's voice stayed soft as smoke, saying a door is still a promise. That promise was why he'd brought blankets and why he'd brought food without bargaining. He told himself it was decency, but loneliness sat close and listened like a witness. When Eleanor said 3 days, Clay nodded calm and pretended he hadn't already decided. He'd lived 3 years with only his own footsteps, and now the house had breath. That breath came as small sounds: a pot settling, a page turning, a whispering laugh. Clay felt the hollow places fill, and he hated how fast his heart accepted it. He'd sworn off trouble, because trouble cost blood, and he didn't have blood to spare. But trouble had a way of finding men, especially men who tried to stay invisible. The storm that night felt different, like it carried messages and knew where to deliver. Even his horses sensed it, ears pinned back, and hooves stamping at shadows they couldn't name. Clay watched the barn, counting seconds between lightning and listening for hoofbeats in the dark. He knew riders could come quiet, using rain for cover and using cruelty for courage. He also knew women didn't run this hard unless something worse than weather chased them. Eleanor's scraped knuckles told stories, and Vivian's eyes told different ones, sharper and meaner. Lila's quiet told the truest story, fear that's old enough to have manners now. Clay had seen that fear on kids after raids and on widows after courthouse lies. It was fear that learned to breathe slow and to keep hope hidden in pockets. Sitting there, Clay remembered his father's rule: you don't turn away need in storms. He also remembered another rule: you don't invite wolves inside because they bring friends later. The West didn't care which rule you chose, it only charged you for choosing it all. Clay stared at the rain. He imagined hired guns at his fence, calling women thieves and calling murder a misunderstanding. Clay had seen that kind of talk. It was always clean words, hiding dirty intentions. He promised himself he'd be ready, and he checked his ammunition by feel, not sight. Outside, the rain eased some, but the night stayed heavy and Clay stayed awake. He listened for the barn door, for steps, for any cry, and for the sound of lies. He wondered what these sisters had lost, and felt his own life balancing on a thin fence rail. If he sent them away, he kept peace, and he kept his heart locked tight. If he let them stay, he risked everything, and he risked wanting them to stay. Wanting was dangerous, because wanting makes you brave, and bravery makes you visible to predators. Clay touched the window frame, feeling old wood shake, and he imagined boots on his porch. He imagined a man with money, smiling polite and asking questions like he owned answers, and how many miles they'd paid for it. He wondered what kind of man hunts women and calls it business and sleeps fine. Then he wondered what kind of man watches and does nothing and still calls himself good. That question burned slow, because Clay knew the answer, and he didn't like it. He'd hidden on this ranch, calling it peace, while the world kept bleeding beyond hills. Now 3 strangers had crossed his fence line, and his peace started asking a price. In the barn, Lantern light flickered once, and Clay felt the night tighten around him. Somewhere out there, a rider would eventually appear, and Clay would have to stand. He didn't know their real names, but he knew their fear, and he knew his own. Clay exhaled slow, whispered his mother's name, and watched the dark like it might speak. When the wind shifted, it carried sage and warning, and Clay finally admitted he'd changed. Dawn broke hard over the flats, and Clay stepped into mud, listening for damage, and listening for riders nearby today. The sky looked scrubbed clean, but the land lay bruised with bent grass and fences leaning like tired men still. From the barn came soft voices and the steady scrape of a brush, calming horses that hadn't forgiven thunder yet. Clay paused at the doorway and saw 3 figures moving with purpose, as if work was the only prayer left. Eleanor had sleeves rolled, and she murmured to a nervous mare keeping her body between danger and her sisters always. Vivian forked wet straw aside, and her motions were quick, practiced, and a little angry at the world too often. Lila carried feed in a dented pan, whispering to each stall like quiet words could stitch fear shut for now. Clay cleared his throat, and all 3 looked up at once, eyes sharp as if expecting a blow again soon. "It's just me," Clay said, keeping a calm voice. "Because calm is the only thing you can offer first thing." Eleanor nodded once, but she didn't relax. And Clay respected her for that, because relaxing gets folks hurt out here. He walked the fence line with them, pointing to snap posts, and Vivian measured distances like a surveyor would do. She didn't ask for permission, she just set her jaw and started working like she trusted muscle more than words. Clay handed Eleanor a hammer, and she took it careful, then swung true, not missing once all morning long either. Lila stayed near the house sorting nails, and her fingers trembled sometimes, but she never complained about anything at all. By mid-morning, Clay realized they weren't pretending to help. They genuinely knew ranch work, and they needed it badly too. Work gave them shape, and it gave Clay a reason to look forward instead of back at crosses each day. When the sun climbed high, Eleanor wiped her brow, and Clay caught bruises on her forearm half hidden by cloth. He didn't stare, he just filed it away, the way a man stores winter hay for later trouble and need. Vivian noticed his glance, and she lifted her chin, daring him to ask, daring him to judge her today too. Clay only said, "You swing that fork like you mean it." And Vivian answered, "I always do, sir. Don't worry." Eleanor shot her sister a look, and Vivian smiled, because smiles are weapons when you're tired and cornered like that. Near noon, Lila wandered inside, and Clay saw her studying the little shelf of books by the window again quietly. She touched a spine like it was rare treasure, and Clay felt his mother's house breathe soft once more today. "If you want one," Clay said, "take it," and Lila looked up, startled then grateful. "For real this time, sir?" Eleanor stepped in behind her, and for a moment her guard dropped, seeing her sister's smile so bright and pure. Then the guard returned quick as a shutter, and Eleanor said they shouldn't get comfortable. Not here, not ever again. Clay pretended not to hear that last word, and he went back outside, checking the far ridge for dust plumes. The land stayed empty, but emptiness can be a lie, because men with bad intent travel quiet when they're close. By afternoon, the barn looked steadier, fences straighter, and Clay felt something like pride, then distrust in his own heart. He'd learned that good days can turn cruel fast, and he didn't want to hope too loud with strangers nearby. Still, when supper time came, Clay said, "You're eating with me," and he didn't make it a question tonight either. Eleanor started polite refusal, but Vivian cut in, saying, "We're hungry," and the honesty made Clay smile a little inside. They washed at the pump, and mud ran off sleeves, and Lila shivered, though the sun was warm right then. Clay tossed her a dry cloth, and she thanked him soft. Like gratitude was dangerous to show too much yet. Inside, the house smelled of beans and salt pork, and the 3 sisters paused, taking it in like a dream. Clay kept his eyes on the pot, because watching them watch his home felt like being seen again after years. Vivian sank into a chair, boots off, rubbing raw blisters, and Clay pointed her to salve without a lecture too. Eleanor chose the window seat where she could see the yard, and Clay understood her need for control and warning. Lila opened a book, and her lips moved as she read, like she was rebuilding herself line by line quietly. Clay set bowls on the table, and the sound of 4 spoons felt strange, then surprisingly right to him now. They ate slow, saving face, but Clay saw hunger in careful bites, and he offered more anyway for each of. Vivienne accepted first, and Eleanor frowned, but Lila's eyes softened, because kindness feeds more than stomachs when you're scared, silly. After supper, Clay mentioned Dry Creek again, and Eleanor's fork stopped and the room cooled for a breath or two. No law, Eleanor said, then corrected herself, saying no time for towns, and Clay let it pass, this once only. Instead, he offered work fences, garden horses, and he kept his tone practical, not pitying, because pity cuts deep too. Eleanor's eyes narrowed, and she asked why, and Clay answered because one man can't do it all forever by himself. Vivienne laughed once, not joyful, and she said, 3 days, that's all, then we're gone before trouble catches us too. Clay nodded, but he saw Eleanor's shoulders slump like she'd been carrying 3 lives on one spine for months straight. He offered the spare room, and Eleanor hesitated, eyes flicking toward the closed door like it held ghosts inside still. Vivienne answered for them, saying, we'll take it, and Clay heard Eleanor's breath release just slightly into the quiet hall. That night, the house filled with small sounds, pages turning, boots set aside, and a kettle settling near warm coals. Clay sat on his porch whittling, telling himself he was guarding horses, and not guarding hope itself from getting hurt. He heard murmurs from the Barn sisters talking low, and he kept distance, but the words carried on night air. Vivienne said they couldn't run forever, and Eleanor answered sharp, because sharpness is how leaders stay standing when they're afraid. Lila spoke quiet, and Clay heard her say, evil follows, and he felt his hand tighten on wood without thinking. Clay shifted. A board creaked and voices stopped because hunted people notice tiny sounds that safe folks miss every time. Eleanor stepped out, pistol low, and Clay showed himself in moonlight, saying he couldn't sleep. That's all tonight, my friend. Vivienne watched him, then asked again, can you handle us all? And Clay answered, yes, plain and final right now. Eleanor looked away, fighting tears she wouldn't show, and Clay understood. Strength sometimes means not falling apart in front of. Clay said, rest inside and I'll watch, and the sisters finally moved like permission mattered more than pride after all. When the door closed, Clay stared at the dark hills, and he felt the ranch turning into something new today. He didn't know their true names, but he knew their fear, and he recognized it as his own too well. 3 days, he repeated in his mind, and the words sounded like a lie and like a prayer at once. Out west, prayers don't stop bullets, but they do steady hands, and Clay wanted steady hands ahead for what's coming. He checked his rifle, counted cartridges, and listened to night sounds, until even coyotes went quiet, far off, somewhere out. In that stillness, Clay admitted a truth: he'd already chosen them before anyone asked him to, for real this time. He pictured Eleanor's bruises, Vivienne's defiance, Lila's books, and he felt his lonely ears crack open just a little more. Clay whispered, I won't run anymore, and the wind answered with sage scent like approval from old spirits out there. He kept watch until the stars faded, and when dawn touched the ridges, he was still awake, ready to stand. Somewhere beyond the empty miles, a man would hear rumors, and Clay Mercer would meet those rumors head-on soon. By the third evening, the ranch felt warmer, but Clay's nerves stayed cold because quiet can hide footsteps too well. Eleanor noticed it first, pausing mid-stitch, and watching the horizon as if the hills were blinking at her again. Vivienne kept a smile ready, yet her hand drifted near a knife whenever wind rattled the porch boards at night. Lila read beside the lamp, but she flinched at every hoofbeat imagined, and Clay pretended not to notice it either. After supper, Eleanor asked where the nearest telegraph was, and Clay said Dry Creek had one barely working these days. That answer made her jaw tighten, because a working wire meant news could travel faster than horses could ever did. Clay studied her face, and he saw calculation there, not panic like she'd planned routes for months already, alone, often. Vivienne caught his look, and she shook her head once, warning him not to dig. Not yet today, please, sir. Clay didn't like being managed in his own house, but he understood. Fear speaks in commands, sometimes for survival only. Later, while fixing a gate hinge, Clay found boot prints near the arroyo, fresh enough to shine in mud still. They weren't his, and they weren't the sisters', because the tread was heavy military and walked in pairs too tight. Clay followed the tracks a short way, then stopped because the smartest man knows when he's being lured on purpose. When he returned, Eleanor was washing blood from her knuckles, and she claimed it was fence wire. "Nothing more, sir." Clay nodded, but he'd seen fighting wounds before. Sometimes they smile politely in church pews. Clay felt his stomach turn because he'd met those smiles in towns where money bought forgiveness fast for ugly acts. He asked Eleanor for a name, just one, and she stared at the floor like names were dynamite in pockets. Finally, she said Silas Reddick, and the room seemed to shrink, because even Clay had heard that name before once. Reddick owned water rights, grazing leases, and half the courthouse, and fence wire doesn't bruise wrists like shackles do at all, ever. That night wind eased and the stars came out, yet Eleanor kept the lamp low, like hiding was a habit. Vivienne sat on the steps, sharpening her knife, and she told Clay she'd rather bleed than beg again from anyone. Clay said he wasn't asking for begging, and Vivienne answered, "Men always ask. They just use softer words at first." Lila looked up from her book and whispered that monsters don't always growl, and folks called him respectable in daylight to their shame. At night, they called him worse things, but only behind closed doors, and never where a deputy listened too closely. Eleanor said Reddick didn't chase them for money, he chased them for control and for silence about one bad night. Clay didn't ask details, because Lila's hands shook and Vivian's jaw locked like pain was biting through old scars today. Instead, he asked what Reddick's men looked like, and Eleanor said they wore dust and acted confident as paid wolves. She described one with a gray beard, cold eyes, and a smile thin as wire, and Clay pictured Boone instantly. Vivian said they'd learned a pattern: a friendly question first, then threats, then fire when answers disappointed the wrong man. Clay felt anger rise, but he kept it buried because anger makes noise, and noise draws guns from far away. Eleanor admitted they'd stolen a horse once, not for greed, but because walking meant dying on open flats in summer. Clay said he didn't care about that, and Eleanor looked surprised, like mercy had become unfamiliar language to her ears. Vivian warned him, "If you stand with us, you'll wear our target, and you can't take it off later easy." Clay answered, "I've worn worse targets," and he didn't explain because war memories don't like daylight in any season either. Lila asked if justice ever wins, and Clay said, "It can, but it needs witnesses, and stubborn hearts to show." Eleanor said witnesses get buried, and her voice was flat, like she'd counted graves in silence for months on end. Clay walked outside alone, staring at the hills because he needed space to decide what kind of man he'd become. He remembered hiding after cholera, calling it survival, while other families suffered under men like Reddick without any help coming. When Clay turned back, Vivian was saddling midnight quietly, and Eleanor watched the road, counting minutes again like a clock. They were ready to flee even after dinner, because safety never stayed longer than a heartbeat for them out here. Clay said, "Don't run yet. Running tells hunters they're right, and it turns rumor into truth in their minds fast." Eleanor asked what he proposed, and Clay said, "We prepare, and we make them doubt their aim before they strike." Vivian liked that, and she smiled sharp, because doubt is poison, and poison works best unseen at the start always. Lila asked if they'd be believed, and Eleanor said belief is purchased unless you force truth into daylight somehow first. Clay checked his rifles, counted shells, and chose the porch as his line because that's where talk begins with wolves. Eleanor watched him work, and she finally said thank you, like the words hurt and still mattered to her deeply. Clay answered, "Don't thank me yet, because the first visit won't be bullets, it'll be questions and smiles too clean." Vivian said she could lie, and Clay believed her because her eyes could burn and still look innocent to strangers. Lila asked if lying was wrong, and Clay said, "Sometimes it's a bridge, and bridges keep families alive at night." Eleanor flinched at the word family, then steadied because she wanted it and feared losing it again too soon here. Outside, the wind shifted, and a far coyote called, and Clay took it as a warning bell for what followed. He told them, "Tomorrow we act normal," because hunters trust normal more than they trust silence on roads near home. Vivian laughed softly and said normal is the best disguise, since evil expects panic, not supper plates and mended shirts. Eleanor said if Reddick's men came, she'd keep her sisters behind her even if it killed her right there first. Clay replied, "You won't die alone here," and Eleanor's eyes flashed because promises can be dangerous gifts to accept fully. Lila closed her book, and asked Clay if he ever loved anyone, and he said he'd tried once long ago. Vivian teased him, then softened, and told Lila that love is a risk like crossing rivers in spring with ice. Eleanor cut that talk short because romance makes noise, and noise makes men careless when rifles matter the most. Soon. Clay agreed, yet he watched their faces and realized he'd already started caring, which was the real trap for him. Before bed, Clay barred the door, checked windows, and placed extra cartridges by Lila without making a show of it. Then he sat in the dark, listening to the hills, knowing the first knock would come soon, wearing manners today. Dust rose beyond the ridge, and Clay saw 5 riders moving straight for Mercer Gate. He climbed down fast and called for Vivian because trouble doesn't announce itself with kindness. Vivian looked once and her smile vanished, leaving only steel behind her tired green eyes. Eleanor came from the garden, and Lila followed close, holding herself small in bright daylight. Clay said, "Get inside now," and nobody argued because they'd heard that tone before. He checked his Colt again and felt the old calm settle like winter over river. The rider stopped outside the fence, and the lead man tipped his hat with false manners. "My name's Boone Kessler," he said, and his voice carried easy across the yard. "We're tracking 3 women," Boone added, "and I'd hate to trouble a hard-working rancher." Clay kept his rifle visible and answered, slow, "I don't keep ledgers on passers-by." Boone smiled thinly, and his eyes slid past Clay, measuring the house like inventory. One rider dismounted near the pump, and another drifted wide, pretending he liked scenery. Clay noticed the spread, and he shifted his stance so Boone couldn't miss the warning. "Long ride from Dry Creek," Boone said. "Mind if my boys water their horses here?" Clay nodded toward the pump and replied, "Even water's free, but keep your hands polite." Boone laughed softly and said, "Of course we're just doing honest work for honest pay." Clay asked what kind of pay, and Boone said, "A respectable man pays well when crossed." "Silas Reddick wants his property returned," Boone said, "and he's offering reward for information." Property meaning women, Clay thought, and he felt his jaw tighten, though his face stayed calm. Boone leaned closer in the saddle and asked, "You live alone here with no family?" Clay answered, "Yes, I do." And Boone's eyes narrowed like he'd caught a scent. "Funny thing," Boone said. "Old Perkins claimed 3 women rode this direction during that storm." Clay shrugged once and said, "Perkins drinks hard and he sees ghosts on sunny days." Boone's smile stayed, but his cheeks tightened because lies offend liars when they're challenged openly. He gestured toward the porch and asked, "Mind if I step closer so we can talk?" Clay didn't move aside, and he said, "Talk from there. My porch isn't public ground." Boone tilted his head and said, "You're cautious. Cautious men usually have something worth hiding." Before Clay could answer, the door opened and Eleanor stepped out like a practiced truth. She stood beside Clay, and her posture said home, even if her heart was racing. Eleanor looked at Boone and asked sweetly, "Husband, are these gentlemen bothering you again today?" Clay felt surprise flash, yet he caught it fast and replied, "No, dear, they're leaving soon." Boone blinked once, and his eyes sharpened, because husbands weren't mentioned in Perkins' story earlier. "Ma'am, you seem familiar," Boone said, and his voice turned softer like bait on water. Eleanor smiled without warmth and answered, "I doubt it. I don't mingle with saddle tramps." One of Boone's men chuckled, and Boone's jaw worked because insult lands hardest in front of witnesses. Vivian stepped out next and wiped her hands like she'd been cooking since morning. She called toward the kitchen, "Maggie, your soup's burning," then glanced at Boone with bored contempt. Boone asked how long you ladies been here, and Eleanor replied, "Long enough to belong now." Clay watched Boone's hands and saw one finger twitch toward the leather at his hip. Boone changed tack quickly and asked, "Where's the 3rd sister, since women like you travel 3? From inside the house, Lila began humming low, and the tune sounded like church and mercy. Eleanor spoke over the hymn and said, "My youngest sister's delicate. She avoids rough company, sir." Boone listened, and his eyes drifted to windows, searching for movement, searching for fear to betray them. Clay lifted his rifle a fraction and said, "You've watered your horses. Now ride on out." Boone didn't move yet, and he said, "Reddick claims those women murdered a man in flight." Clay answered steady, "That's a serious claim, but claims aren't proof, and proof matters to me." Boone smiled again and said, "Proof comes later. First we gather stories, then we gather bodies." That line chilled the porch, and Eleanor's shoulders held firm, refusing to show it hurt. Vivienne shifted her weight, and Clay knew she was counting steps, counting angles, counting exits. Boone's rider at the pump walked back slow, and his gaze stuck on Eleanor's bruised forearm. He murmured something low, and Boone's eyes flashed quick like a hawk spotting movement in grass. Boone asked Eleanor, "Your husband seems handy. What's his name? And where'd he come from?" Eleanor didn't glance at Clay and replied, "He's Clay Mercer, and he came from hard work." Boone nodded like he accepted it, yet his smile said he'd check every word twice. Clay said, "Time's up, friend," and Boone replied polite, "Sure, we'll ride, no need for fuss." Boone tipped his hat again, and his eyes lingered because he wanted them to blink first. Eleanor didn't blink, and Vivian didn't either, and Clay felt proud in a dangerous way. As Boone turned his horse, he said, "We'll be nearby if your memory improves later tonight." Clay answered, "It won't," and Boone smiled like he'd heard that promise before from doomed men. The riders filed out, and one looked back twice, marking doors, marking windows, marking lives. When dust finally settled, Eleanor exhaled, and her hands trembled, though her voice stayed steady. Vivian touched Clay's sleeve and said that, "Bought time, but not much. They'll return soon." Clay nodded once, and replied, "They'll verify husbands. They'll ask Dry Creek. They'll dig fast." Lila stepped out slowly and asked, "Did I do right?" And Clay said, "You did perfect." Eleanor looked at Clay then and said, "I'm sorry using you like that, felt wrong." Clay answered, "It was smart, and smart keeps breathing when bad men believe they own truth." Vivian stared at the road and said, "Boone's not the worst. Boone's just the first scout." Clay looked at the ridge and he said, "Reddick will come, because men like that hate doubt." Eleanor's chin lifted, and she said, "Then we stop running, because running only feeds their hunger." Lila's hymn faded, and she whispered, "I'm scared." And Clay replied, "Good fear keeps us sharp." Vivian drew her knife and said, "Tell me where your rifles are, because I'm done hiding." Clay pointed inside and said, "We'll plan careful, because courage without plan is just a grave." Eleanor squeezed Lila's hand and said, "We hold together, because wolves pick off the separated first." Clay watched the road again and knew the next knock wouldn't bring smiles. It'd bring fire. Night settled soft, but Clay's house stayed tight because Boone's smile had left a shadow on every wall tonight, too. Eleanor barred the back door, Vivian checked the windows, and Lila sat on the floor, breathing slow, listening carefully now. Clay laid cartridges on the table, not in panic, but in order, like prayer beads for stubborn men out here. He said, "Nobody shoots first, because first shots start stories, and stories travel faster than horses in Redwater County." Vivian snorted at that, then nodded anyway, because she'd seen how rumors turn into ropes when lawmen look away. Eleanor kept her voice low, and she said, "Boone will return after midnight when he thinks we're sleeping, helpless." Lila asked if they'd burn the house, and Clay answered they might, because cowards love fire when bullets feel risky. He walked them through positions: porch for him, back window for Eleanor, side wall for Vivian, and floor for Lila. Lila hated the floor, but Clay said low keeps you breathing, and breathing is the first rule of every fight. Vivian checked her rifle again, hands steady, eyes bright, and Clay respected her discipline more than her sharp tongue. Eleanor counted shells twice, then once again, because leaders count when fear tries to steal their thinking. The lamp was turned down, curtains pinned, and the house became a box of quiet, waiting for footsteps. Clay listened to the night, and he could hear the ranch, breathing boards, settling horses, shifting, and coyotes far away. He thought about his family graves, and he promised them softly he wouldn't let this home become another cemetery again. Minutes passed slow, and Lila whispered a hymn under her breath, not loud enough to carry, just enough to steady. Vivian told her to save her breath, then immediately softened, and touched her shoulder like an apology without words tonight. Eleanor watched the yard through a crack, and her eyes never stopped moving, like she was reading darkness itself. Clay felt the first sign, a change in the horses, a sudden stillness, the kind that comes before thunder or men. He lifted 2 fingers, and everyone froze, because silence is the best weapon until you're forced to spend it. Then he heard it, a scuff at the barn corner. Careful boots, testing mud, trying not to speak. Vivian's jaw tightened, and she mouthed how many, and Clay mouthed back more than Boone brought earlier today. Eleanor's breathing stayed even, but her knuckles went white, and Clay knew she was holding back old memories hard. Lila's eyes shone in the dim, and she looked at Clay like a child asking permission to survive. Clay nodded once, and Lila gripped the shotgun tighter, because courage sometimes begins with a single nod in darkness. A shadow crossed the porch rail, and Clay felt his pulse slow, because fear fades when work takes over. He waited for the mistake because hired guns always make one either too eager or too sure of themselves. The mistake came as a boot against the step, a small scrape, and Clay saw a shape lean toward the door. Clay fired one shot through the window frame, aimed low, not to be cruel, but to drop the attacker fast. The night exploded with noise, glass, cracking, horses screaming, and bullets thudding into wood like angry fists on a coffin. Vivian answered with controlled fire. 2 shots, then a pause, because wasting lead is the same as begging later. Eleanor fired from the back, steady and calm, and her rhythm sounded like someone who'd practiced in nightmares for months. Lila flinched at the first blast, then forced herself to breathe because Clay's earlier lesson had landed deep. A man shouted from outside, and another voice cursed Boone's name, proving Clay right about who sent them in. Clay shouted, "Stay low, keep angles, and don't chase, because chasing turns defenders into targets on open ground." Vivian called out they're moving to the side window, and Clay shifted, tracking muzzle flashes instead of faces tonight. He fired again, timed between flashes because you don't need to see a man to stop him. Bullets punched the porch post, splinters flying, and Clay tasted wood dust, but he didn't back away once. Eleanor yelled, "Back corner," and Clay heard boots running quick and light, trying to circle like wolves do. Vivian moved to cut them off, but Clay snapped hold position because bravery without cover turns into mourning later. Lila raised the shotgun, hands shaking, and Clay whispered, "Breathe, aim, squeeze like you're closing a door gently." The shotgun boomed once and the recoil shoved Lila back, but outside a man cried out, then went quiet. Lila stared at the barrel, shocked, and Clay said, "Good job," because praise matters when someone's soul is trembling. The attackers hesitated after that because hunters don't like prey that bites, especially when it bites true. Clay heard Boone's voice at the edge, low and angry, ordering them forward because he couldn't stand retreat. Eleanor shouted back, "Tell Boone he's not welcome," and her voice carried steel, not fear, into the night. A rifle cracked from the barn, and Clay realized one man had slipped there, trying to flank the house unseen. Vivian cursed once, then shifted her aim, and Clay saw her patience, waiting for the barn shadow to move again. When it did, she fired, and the barn went still, proving she wasn't just talk, she was skill. The shooting thinned because injured men don't fight well and paid men don't die well for other men's pride. Clay called out last chance ride off because he wanted them gone, not piled up in his yard. A voice answered with spite, then another shot hit the eaves and Clay returned fire, ending that argument quickly. After that, hooves pounded away fast and frantic, and the night swallowed them like they were never brave at all. Clay didn't chase, he waited, counting breaths, because Boone would love a second trap after the first failed tonight. Eleanor stayed at her window listening until she heard only wind and only the small creak of cooling wood. Vivian reloaded in silence, then said they'll come back bigger because Boone won't admit he lost to women. Lila's eyes filled, but she didn't cry, and Clay saw a new hardness forming, the kind survival builds. Eleanor stepped into the lamplight, and her face looked older yet calmer because truth had finally met resistance. Clay checked everyone for cuts, and he said, "We're alive," but this was only the first knock. Vivian looked at the dark yard and asked if he still wanted peace, and Clay answered, "Peace is earned." He set fresh boards over the broken window, then said, "Tomorrow we plan, because Reddick will hear gunfire soon." Clay woke before sunrise, and he tasted smoke in the air, though nothing was burning yet. He stepped onto the porch, and the world looked too still, like the land was holding its breath. Vivian joined him, hair loose, eyes sharp, and she pointed to the ridge with her chin. A line of riders sat up there, dark specks against brightening sky, watching like they owned the morning. Eleanor came out next, wrapped in a plain shawl, and she didn't ask how many because she already knew. Lila stood behind them, clutching her book like it was a shield, and Clay hated that she needed shields. Clay counted slow because counting keeps fear from running your hands, and he got to 38 before he stopped. Vivian whispered, "That's not Boone's crew," and Clay answered, "Boone was the knock. This is the door coming down." Eleanor said his name once, Silas Reddick, and the sound of it felt like a chain dropped on wood. Clay went inside, and he laid out rifles, shells, water, and bandages like he was setting a table for war. He told them, "We don't waste shots and we don't waste breath because both run out faster than pride does. Vivian asked if help was coming, and Clay said maybe, but maybe is thin food when men bring torches. Eleanor stared at the ridge and said Dry Creek won't stand up, they've bowed too long already. Clay didn't argue because he'd seen towns fold, and he'd seen them call it peace afterward. Near noon, a single rider approached, holding a white cloth high, and Clay recognized the neighbor, Samuel Rivers. Rivers stopped well short of the fence and called out, "Reddick wants to talk, and you've got 1 hour." Vivian laughed once sharp and ugly, and she said, "Since when does that man talk instead of take?" Rivers shrugged and replied, "Since half the county is watching and he wants it clean on paper." Clay raised his voice and said, "Tell Reddick if he wants words, he can ride here alone." Rivers nodded like it didn't matter, then turned his horse and carried Clay's answer back to the ridge. The hour that followed felt longer than drought because waiting is the cruelest kind of work. Clay moved everyone into positions, and he spoke plain because fancy speeches don't stop bullets. Eleanor took the back window, and she checked angles like she'd been born with a map in her head. Vivienne climbed into the barn loft, and she laid her rifle on sandbags steady as a stone in a river. Lila stayed low in the main room near Doc Eli Harmon's supplies, and Clay told her that wasn't weakness. Doc Harmon had ridden in at dawn, drawn by last night's gunfire, and his face looked tight with worry. Doc said folks in town are talking, and fear is spreading, and fear makes bad choices look reasonable. Clay asked if Judge Amos Whitaker had heard, and Doc said the judge was trying, but men were hiding. Clay nodded once and said, "Then we hold and we make them show their face in daylight." On the ridge, movement began slow and deliberate, and a group peeled off like ants from a hill. 12 men advanced to rifle range, then stopped, and behind them rode Silas Reddick on a black horse. Reddick looked expensive, even from a distance. Coat, clean posture, proud like dirt, was for other people only. He raised a hand and his voice carried smooth as oil, and he called out Clay Mercer. "I'm a reasonable man," Reddick said, "and I'd rather settle this like civilized folks today." Clay stepped onto the porch, rifle visible, and he answered, "There's nothing civilized about hunting women." Reddick's smile held, and he said, "Thieves and killers don't get sympathy, they get returned to their owner." Clay felt Eleanor stiffen behind him, and he kept his tone level, saying, "They're not your property." Reddick's eyes narrowed, and he said, "You're harboring fugitives, and you'll burn with them if you insist." Vivian's rifle glinted in the loft window, and Clay saw Reddick notice it and swallow his anger. Clay said, "Tell your men to keep hands off guns, because my people shoot straighter than yours prey." Reddick laughed once and said, "You've got yourself and 3 women, and I've got 40 men." Clay answered, 4 people defending a home can outvalue 40 men paid to forget their mother's face." Reddick's smile cracked, and he spat words about their mother that Clay won't repeat, because some ugliness stains the air. Lila rose just enough to be seen, and she fired one warning shot into the dirt close to the horse's feet. Reddick's mount reared, guards tensed, and Lila's voice carried calm and bright, saying, "The next goes higher." Reddick fought his horse, face purple with rage, and he shouted, "Girl, you just signed your death warrant." Clay raised his hand and said, "Get off my land and take your sickness with you now." Reddick stared at Clay, then wheeled away, and he called back 1 hour to reconsider before fire. As Reddick retreated, dust rose from the east road, and Clay's heart lifted, then sank hard. Judge Whitaker arrived with only 6 men, faces grim, hands shaking, because courage is heavy when you're not used to it. The judge dismounted, and he said, "It isn't much, but it's what I could pull from fear." Clay looked at those men, farmers and clerks, and he nodded, because showing up matters more than swagger. Vivienne called down, "Put them with me, because the barn will be the first target," and she was right. Clay placed 2 men at side windows, one on the roof with a heavy rifle, and one to run ammunition. Doc Harmon stayed low, sleeves rolled ready for wounds, and Clay prayed he'd have nothing to do. Eleanor touched Clay's arm, and she said, "If this fails, you should run," and Clay shook his head. He said, "If I run now, I'll run forever, and I'm done living like that in my own house." The final hour ended, and Reddick's men spread wide, circling the ranch, cutting every path like wire. Then the first shots came, probing, distant, meant to test courage, and Clay held fire, refusing their rhythm. Vivian waited too, because patience is a weapon, and she'd learned it the hard way. Reddick raised his arm on the ridge, and when it dropped, the world turned loud. Men charged the barn first because they thought wood would break faster than hearts, and they were half right. Vivian fired, controlled, dropping the lead runners, and the men behind them stumbled, shocked that prey had teeth. Clay fired from the porch, choosing targets by movement, not by rage, because rage makes you miss. Eleanor's shots cracked from the back, and she moved like a ghost, appearing, firing, vanishing before return fire found her. Lila stayed low, reloading, breathing, and when a man rushed the porch, she raised the shotgun without screaming. The blast knocked him down, and Lila's eyes went wide. Yet she didn't fold, because she'd decided to live. Clay saw the barn door shudder under pressure, and he sprinted across open ground, trusting timing more than luck. Inside, the barn noise became chaos: boots, shouts, splinters, and the metallic click of levers working fast. Clay shouted, "Hold," and Vivian shouted back, "We're holding, but there's too many," and Clay knew it. Then from the far road came a new sound, many hooves, and a voice calling law and order. Sheriff Wade Carver hit Reddick's flank with deputies, and in seconds the hunters became men looking for exits. Reddick tried to break away, but his own men scattered, and the county finally saw him as just a man. Clay didn't cheer, he just breathed, because winning doesn't feel clean when you've heard so many promises break. Eleanor found Clay's shoulder and said, "It's turning," and Clay answered, "Keep steady, we finish this right." Vivian laughed from the loft, wild and relieved, and she shouted, "You still think you can handle us all?" Clay looked at them and he said, "Together we handle what comes," and he meant every word. When the shooting stopped, the ranch went quiet again, but it wasn't peace, it was the sound of shock alone. Clay stood in the barn doorway, breathing dust and sweat, watching deputies bind wounds, and watching Reddick get taken away. Sheriff Wade Carver kept his voice firm, because men only stay brave when somebody speaks like law still matters. Silas Reddick cursed from the dirt, calling everyone fools, but his words sounded smaller once his power looked breakable. Eleanor didn't answer him. She just held Lila close and stared like she was learning what freedom costs. Vivian sat on a hay bale, reloading slow, then laughing once, because laughter was the only release she had. Doc Eli Harmon moved from person to person, sleeves rolled face tight, doing quiet work that never earned songs. Clay helped carry water, helped tear cloth for bandages, and kept his eyes on the ridgeline anyway. He knew a cornered empire doesn't fall clean, and a man like Reddick always leaves splinters behind him. By late afternoon, deputies dragged the dead away from the yard, and Clay felt a heavy gratitude he didn't celebrate. The ranch looked scarred, boards cracked, glass gone, and dirt trampled, but it still stood, and that mattered. Sheriff Carver asked for statements, and Clay nodded, because truth needs paper, because Reddick's friends might still be listening. Clay didn't like strangers sleeping near his walls, but he liked Reddick's shadow even less. So he accepted. When the sun went down, the four of them sat at the table eating plain beans and feeling unreal together. Eleanor stared at Clay's empty chair across the room, the one nobody used for years, and she set a plate there. She didn't say why, but Clay understood, because grief recognizes its own, even when it wears different names. Not just righteous anger and smoke. Eleanor told her story, short, careful, respectful, refusing to feed the crowd any ugliness they could chew for sport. Vivian added details about Boone, about threats, about the way men smile before they strike, and the sheriff wrote it down. Lila spoke last voice, soft, steady, and Clay saw how strength can live inside gentleness without needing permission. That evening, Carver ordered 2 deputies to stay at the ranch. Vivian tried to tease him, saying, "Your quiet life sure didn't last long, did it?" Rancher and Clay almost smiled. Lila asked if the fighting was truly over, and Clay answered, "The shooting might be, but the story still walks." Sheriff Carver returned at dawn, bringing a wagon and bringing word that Dry Creek was already splitting into sides. Some folks called Clay a hero, and others called him a criminal, because fear loves labels that keep truth distant. Judge Amos Whitaker rode in with tired eyes, and he said the court would move fast if witnesses stayed brave. Eleanor asked what fast meant, and the judge said, "Fast means before money can buy time, and time buys silence." Clay watched Eleanor's shoulders rise, then settle, because she'd lived too long with promises that never showed up. Vivian said, "We'll testify, and we'll do it loud enough that the whole county can't pretend it didn't hear." Lila hesitated, then nodded, because she'd already fired once and courage had found her in the worst moment. The trip into town felt strange because they rode with deputies now and still watched every fence line anyway. Dry Creek's main street was packed and faces turned like weather vanes, searching for the safest direction to lean. Clay saw men he'd traded with, men who'd smiled for years now looking away as if guilt was contagious. He also saw older women step forward, eyes wet, hands shaking. And he realized Reddick's shadow touched many homes. At the courthouse steps, Sheriff Carver kept the crowd back, and he said, "You want justice? Give it room to breathe." Reddick sat inside a cell. Legs, splinted coat. Still fine. Because pride is the last outfit rich men remove. He stared at Eleanor with hate, then glanced at Clay, like Clay was the real insult, a nobody who didn't kneel. Judge Whitaker began the hearing, voice steady, and he spoke about law, not vengeance, and she let silence carry the weight. The lawyer tried to bait her, hinting at shame, hinting at weakness, but Eleanor's eyes stayed level and cold. Vivian followed sharper, harder, and when the lawyer suggested she wanted trouble, she laughed and said trouble wanted her first. Then Lila stood smaller than the room, yet steadier than most men, and she told what she saw without gore. Clay watched the gallery, and he saw faces change because the truth doesn't need decoration. It just needs air. Still, Judge Whitaker frowned, because he knew Reddick's money could still buy doubt, and doubt is all a monster needs. When the hearing ended, the judge pulled Clay aside and said, "We need something solid, something written, something that ties him." Clay thought of the sisters' fear, thought of their long running, and he asked Eleanor if there was anything saved. Eleanor looked at Lila, and Lila's hands twisted. Then she whispered, "I kept notes. I hid them back home, because vengeance scares juries quiet." Reddick's lawyer stood smooth, saying the sisters were thieves, saying Clay was a violent fool, saying money had been stolen. Vivian leaned toward Clay and whispered, "He's selling the lie the way Boone sold it, with clean words and dirty intent." Clay told her, "Keep your temper, because a courtroom is a gunfight where the bullets are questions and pauses." Eleanor testified first, and she refused to perform pain. She just stated facts. Vivian's eyes widened, and she said, "Why didn't you tell us?" And Lila answered, "Because secrets felt safer than hope." Clay didn't scold her. He just nodded, because people don't save evidence when they're busy saving breath. Sheriff Carver agreed to escort them because a trip into Reddick territory was still dangerous even with his hands chained. They rode 2 days to a burned-out homestead, black timbers, weeds high, and a root cellar that smelled like loss. Lila counted stones along a wall, fingers trembling, then pulled one loose, revealing oilcloth wrapped tight, like a heart protected. Inside was a small journal, neat handwriting, dates, names, and the kind of pattern only victims learn to track. Clay read a few lines, jaw set hard because it wasn't drama. It was a slow map of intimidation. Carver whistled low and he said, "This changes things, because patterns turn whispers into charges that even money struggles to erase." On the ride back, they met riders on the trail, not deputies, not friends, just men watching and then moving on. Vivian wanted to chase them off, but Clay said no, let them carry fear back to their bosses instead. Dry Creek was louder when they returned, and not just with voices, with gossip, with anger, with people choosing sides. A woman stepped from a storefront and spit near Eleanor's boots, then hurried away like cowardice needed distance to feel safe. Another woman crossed the street, took Eleanor's hand, and said thank you, and Eleanor blinked like she'd forgotten kindness existed. Judge Whitaker reviewed the journal, face tightening, and he quietly asked for more witnesses, because one voice is easy to attack. That request opened a door, because doors open when someone finally proves the lock can break. A widow came forward saying Reddick threatened her husband over water rights, and he died soon after, and nobody asked why. A rancher spoke about being forced off land, about barns burned, about deputies arriving late and always looking the other way. 2 women testified about unwanted attention, about being cornered by wealth, and about living with fear that never got named. Reddick's lawyer tried to mock them, but the room didn't laugh, because even Dry Creek was tired of pretending. The trial date was set, and Clay took the sisters back to the ranch because safety in town is a rumor. They repaired windows, patched walls, and set boards straight, turning wreckage into routine. Because routine heals men and women. At night, they still kept watch. Not because they expected attack, but because their bodies didn't know how to stop. Clay sat on the porch with coffee and he told them about his family, about cholera, and about burying alone. Eleanor listened like she understood, and she finally said, "You didn't just lose them, you lost the world trusting you." Clay nodded because she was right, and right words are rare and they land deep when they arrive. Vivian softened too, and she said, "I've been sharp with you because men usually want a price and you didn't." Clay answered, "I've paid enough prices in my life. I'm not charging you for breathing." Lila asked if Clay ever regretted opening the barn that night, and Clay said, "Regret is easy, but cowardice lasts longer." The trial began under hot sun. Courthouse packed, and Sheriff Carver posted deputies like fence posts against a storm. Reddick entered in chains, still proud, and Clay saw that pride is sometimes just fear wearing expensive boots. Judge Whitaker kept the room quiet, and he let the journal speak through dates, through patterns, through patient handwriting. Reddick's lawyer tried to claim it was forged, but Lila's calm voice held and her details matched other testimonies. Then the prosecutor produced Reddick's ledger, seized by warrant listing payments that lined up with threats and visits. The courtroom shifted like a big animal turning, and Reddick's face darkened because paper had finally cornered him. Reddick shouted insults, tried to stand, and deputies forced him down, and the judge warned him to stay silent. Clay watched jurors exchange looks, and he knew the county's spell was breaking one hard truth at a time. When the verdict came guilty, Eleanor didn't cheer, she just closed her eyes like she was finally setting a burden down. Vivian exhaled long and shaking, and Lila whispered, "Mama can rest now." And Clay felt tears he didn't show. Outside, the crowd sounded different, less sharp, more human, like fear had loosened its grip on their throats. Some folks still muttered, but more people nodded, and that small shift meant the future might actually change. Back at the ranch, the sunset looked softer, and Clay realized the land hadn't changed, only the weight on it. Eleanor stood by the fence post where Clay used to stand alone, and she said, "What happens now?" Clay answered, "Now we rebuild. Not just boards and fences, but the part of us that forgot we deserved peace." Vivian rested her hand on the rail and asked, "Do we belong here, or was this only survival?" Clay looked at all three, and he said, "You belong wherever you stop running and decide your life is worth guarding." Lila smiled small and she asked, "Even me?" And Clay replied, "Especially you, because gentle hearts keep places decent." Eleanor finally let herself breathe, and she said, "Then we stay not as guests. What's the line you won't let a bully cross anymore, even if it costs you, but as family who chose?" Clay nodded, and he felt the house behind him, not empty anymore, not haunted the same way. He lifted his coffee and spoke like an old cowboy talking to a friend, saying evil counts on good men staying quiet. Clay finished saying, "I stayed quiet too long and it cost me years, so I won't do that again." Then he asked the question he'd carried to the audience, and it hung in the dusk like truth. "When you've lived long enough,